Thank you very much. I was thinking as Richard was introducing me two things. I mean, one is it's too bad that books of literary criticism don't have prefaces about the author, because I would just steal the remarks. And the other is it's one of the few pleasures of getting old, that you have a certain kind of imaginative body that's not your decaying body that you sort of hear about in introductions, and it's an extremely pleasant version of identity. In some ways, identity is a better thing than literary critics treat it as. Okay. The one thing, I don't have a clock, so I guess I'll just, okay. I have one. Okay. Because this paper is sort of endless, and I mean, I intend to cut it a lot, as you'll see. Okay, anyway. So I begin with an epigraph. The concept of an aspect is related to the concept of imagination. In other words, the concept "now I see it as" is related to now I am imagining that. Doesn't it take imagination to hear something as a variation on a particular theme? And yet one does perceive something in so hearing it. When is the last time that you read contemporary criticism that was explicitly concerned with the activity of the imagination? Such occasions seem increasingly rare. Imagination now is very rarely spoken of, like the family member whose past seems an embarrassment for an eager new generation of social climbers. I contend the other pleasure of getting old is you can trash your younger colleagues endlessly and sort of escape, because they figure this grouchy, we're not going to bother. Okay. I contend that this disappearance of imagination from critical discourse presents a substantial problem for literary studies. With no mode of production specific to what many literary texts embody, and with no sense of the kinds of power for which they strive, one comes to see immediately the negative side of contemporary criticism's turn to moral and political critical orientations. But my purposes here are not primarily to elaborate problems in contemporary attitudes. In my view, Derek Attridge had done a fine job articulating the limitations of what he calls criticism's turn to the instrumental roles of using literature to establish objects of knowledge. For Attridge, literary critics increasingly ignore the values produced by attention to the singularity of the text in order to pursue how other disciplines like sociology and economic history might stage relations between texts and their historical context. Instead, my job here is to develop one reason for this change in a way that may lead us back to fascination with how particular authors pursue values that depend on the working of imagination. Devoting oneself to studying these values will probably never have the appeal of being able to test new generalizations or feeling that one is constructing knowledge on which others can build. But this loss of social purpose can be compensated for by a much richer sense of what specific literary experiences can offer individual agents. And the turn to imagination is simply more accurate to the distinctive powers literary texts both engage and develop. It is rarely for purposes of knowledge that one rereads text or lets oneself dwell on how they handle details and shape structures. Without a powerful account of the productive forces these texts cultivate and shape as significant singular objects, we cannot see them as contributing anything distinctive to social life. They become mere instances of general conditions elaborated by the critic. Of course, those of us who teach those values may be the latest generation of Casaubons, doomed to what is not just unfashionable, but genuinely benighted. Sometimes in class, I just think that I identify totally with Casaubon. But my fear only intensifies my desire to try out the alternatives by diagnosing why the concept of productive imagination has lost its currency, and by developing what powers a renewed secular model of its workings might afford our social practices. Romantic poetry sought to resist the primarily discursive social focus of their predecessors, predecessors by what Coleridge theorized as the esemplastic imagination. This version of imagination could explain how imaginative writing might afford its society two fundamental powers. First, writing, especially poetic writing, might demand what Nietzsche would call slow reading, because it could make present the work of subjective energies in the process of establishing emotional significance for the phenomena engaged by the text. Tracking the productive power of these subjective energies just is the means by which we come to encounter the text's power. Concerns for discursive meaning or truth values simply require displacing the qualities of the productive activity traced by the slow reading. For example, by this focus on action, a poem like Tintin Abbey could criticize the passions of the poet's youth, yet dialectically find those passions the source for an expansive sense of how the imagination could view or identify with, could view the symbolic identification of nature and mind. Second, poetry could honor this sense of expanded spirit at home in nature by claiming for itself a distinctive mode of truth. Not truth to the facts of nature, but truth to what the spirit's enthusiasms might establish because of the specific deployment that gets exemplified in the work. These ways of focusing consciousness provide public articulations of what can be involved in our reflections on our experiences. These romantic experiments in isolating imagination as a productive force do not have to be taken as efforts to shore up kind of waning Christian beliefs, though that's the Jesuit part. I still am committed to something positive about the activity of thinking. But the enthusiastic speculation on what enthusiasm might involve did not fare very well in the 20th century critical discourse, because it encountered such intense demands to justify what criticism could contribute to a secular world shaped by the discoveries of science. A scientific culture demanded ways of turning such experiences into objects of study rather than indulgences in sympathetic participation. So the dominant force in American literary criticism in the middle of the 20th century, the writing and the teaching of the new criticism, endeavored to reject most of Romantic poetry while trying to save its celebration of the imagination by transforming it into terms more appropriate for a restrained secular set of discursive practices. I.A. Richards has to be the primary figure in this story because of how thoroughly his book on Coleridge became prelude to his utter psychologizing of reading as the activation of both positive and negative impulses in the mind. What I mean by psychologizing reading is it sort of doesn't matter what the object is as long as the pheromones get balanced in their affective complexity. Okay, I mean, that's Richards' basic argument. Gone entirely is Coleridge's model of expressive encounter, fusing the mind with the forces driving nature. The Christian new critics hated Richard's versions of psychology, as they hated all scientism. But in order to combat the increasing importance of empirical truth in their society, they had to put the claims for their beloved imagination in terms more compatible with science than even those employed by Richards. They had to insist that the imagination was a vehicle for developing what they called non-discursive truths. And in my generation, that was the sort of bypass. Everybody believed in I still sort of do, in fact. But capable of establishing objective ways of reflecting on experience that were undeniably as real as what empiricism could show, yet indemonstrable by any resource science could invoke. And in the same spirit, they transformed Coleridge's notion of organicism. What had been evidence in the text of how the mind could fuse with nature became merely a formal condition characterizing the density and fusion of internal relations within the literary text. The new critics purchased a kind of truth for imagination by gutting romantic views of expressive agency and turning all assertion into paradox and dramatic irony. They thought they could expunge manifest signs of subjectivity while projecting the need to treat text very much as persons. Now, I'm sorry for this long story, but I think I got it right, so the most amusing and perhaps the saddest aspect of my narrative involves Paul de Man's largely successful effort to resuscitate Romantic poetry by showing how that poetry brilliantly challenged every value that the new critics would deploy to save the concept of a distinctive literary imagination. And I'm not going to in the paper, I developed Demon's arguments, and I criticized this sense of ontologizing the imagination. So it's one thing, rather than a set of actions that can be that can be made in the world. I mean, I think that's his fundamental error, Demon. But it's just lovely to see this. This to transfer. No, the poetry was right and the critics were wrong, rather than the poetry was wrong and the criticism of imagination could be restated secularly. Okay, so this is Demon. The lesson to be derived from the evolution of American formalist criticism is twofold. It reaffirms, first of all, the necessary presence of a totalizing principle as the guiding impulse of the critical process. In the new criticism, this principle consisted of a purely empirical notion of the integrity of literary form. Yet the mere presence of such a principle could lead to the disclosure of distinctive structures of literary language, such as ambiguity and irony, although these structures contradict the very premises on which the new criticism was founded. That is, the premise is that you can deal with text rather than persons. But ambiguity and irony for Demon are irreducibly states that have to be interpreted as deriving from intentions rather than features of objects. So Demon can also argue that the new critics. So the one argument, one undoing, I think, of the power of this discourse about imagination is its capacity to assume that the object could speak, and you could safely do away with the issues of the expressive person. And second, he could claim that the whole notion of the formal object is based on another kind of evasion of intentions. This is Demon again. The difference between the stone and the chair distinguishes a natural object from an intentional object. The intentional object requires a reference to a specific act as constitutive of its being. So, in a sense, the new criticism banished the role of the maker, but insisted on all the powers of what could only be made rather than found. But also, for Demon, that the new criticism made it suspicious any positive role for a maker, so that what Demon takes his notion of imagination from Sartre, which is a kind of the presence of the non-being within being, and then he sort of analyzes those various features. But I didn't see until right now the fact that there's no room for any positive account of person, because the whole apparatus of the new criticism needs to be dismantled for Demon, and the language of dismantling doesn't include any kind of positive role of person. Okay, so that's the kind of story, and I think post Demon, really the criticism sort of abolishes the concept of imagination as a kind of embarrassment, both either as a romantic embarrassment or as a kind of secular scientific formalist embarrassment. And so there's no sort of middle ground. So what I want to do is to elaborate a kind of phenomenological approach to the imagination in order to sort of recuperate in really quite secular terms where affective energies can move around in the objects of writing, and what kind of sort of epistemological properties you need when you're talking about these constructions of imagination. Those are the two primary concerns. I want to avoid the collaborators in ontologizing the imagination, which I think happened in Heidegger and in Husserl. So I'm going to use this book by Edward Casey called Imagining a Phenomenological Study, which is, I think, 1976, so it's kind of ancient. But I still think it's powerful, and I only take aspects of his argument, partially because I don't know whether this is a legitimate move or not, but I like it. I want to say that trying to do a phenomenology of imagination entirely gets you into hallucination and into all kinds of states that are ontologically problematic. So I want to do almost a kind of grammatical phenomenology where the concern is, what can we mean when we say imaginatively? Or what can we mean when we say with imagination? So I make this gesture in this paper. I'm not sure what it entails. And I hope you may help me, not help me too much, but just have a richer sense of the possibility and impossibility of this kind of grammatical move, okay? So I'm going to use Casey's categories, but eventually try to narrow them to what it would mean to say something is imaginative or done with imagination or imaginatively, okay? And as I say, otherwise the topic gets too large. And I'm going to use Ashbery's instructional manual because I think the instruction manual is an instruction manual about imagining, finally. And then this is worth. I gave this paper at Irvine, and Virginia Jackson is a terrific sort of scholar of poetry, and she argued that Ashbery's poem was the same thing as Bryant's *The Prairie* in the 19th century. I just couldn't believe it, so I didn't read it, right? But finally, she sent me the poem, and it is. And so my point is that one direction of this essay could be to deal with poems of place going to Upon Appleton House and to Penshurst, and I think that would be a kind of significant way to make the imagination, some of the imagination's practical powers available. But I go to Yeats because I want to sort of get at mainly to set the imagination against the empirical understanding. And I think the ending, especially the second question in Leda and the Swan, really articulates that. And there are, if you do such a strange conjunction as Ashbery and Yeats, all of a sudden you realize, for example, for me, how the process of selection works in a sonnet, but especially in Yeats's sonnet, right? It's radically selective. And, you know, what kind of language, a framework would you care about the dynamics of selection? I think imagination is that framework. So the differences in Ashbery and Yeats speak to also their kind of possibility of a critical dialogue between them, I guess. So I'm going to borrow four categories from Casey. And just imagine that two people are planning to have lunch, right? And they're just imagining where they can have lunch, or even if they're two interested people, what might happen because of lunch. Or, I mean, all sorts of things that happen with imagination. The first condition is, however much these actions might seem determined in retrospect, at the moment of imagining, these agents can seem free from all practical restrictions. Both at the pole of subjects, they can do it, and at the pole of object, the things can be done. One can picture this couple with almost unlimited freedom to determine where they will go and what the menu might be, in contrast to all practical judgment. Even if they know they cannot afford something, they can imagine treating what they can afford as if it were the place they wish they could attend. Right, so this sense of freedom that matters partially because of the second trait, which is that there's an infinite set of possibilities for composing and combining the details of the situation, in sharp contrast with the demands in typical situations where perception shapes discourse. Think here of 14th century Florentine and Sienese painting, so of piece with the kind of fantastic dimension of saints' lives. Perception works in the terms of the logic of picturing. It activates a relation to a physical world with its own deep structure, that is, the physical world's own deep structure, independent of the perceiver, who contributes a perspective but not a shape, right? If you add a shape to perception, you're not perceiving, you're doing something else. In the order of perceptions, there are degrees of visibility. Some properties of the scene are foregrounded, some grasped only fleetingly, and some assert pressures that are not noticed at all, like a history of previous interaction. There's a history and a shape to the menu that determines how its particular aspects are to be read. But with an imagined situation, there's no inherent logic and no pressure to recognize specific salient details. Saliency is determined by the imaginers, and there is phenomenologically no other world that imposes underlying demands. As a student of mine put it, imagination is the only guarantee for the shape taken by its contents. Our constructed menu might be fit for the gods in that sense. All right. So there's this sense of the freedom of the agents, and more important, the freedom of the details and their relations. Such freedom does not entail that imaginers will not choose to present their materials as if they were bound to the logic of perception. But these literary imaginings will usually have their moments when the authors revel in their freedom and simply select what feels right rather than what would be demanded were they to follow a historian's practice. Yet at the same time, the freedom itself can appear as insubstantial because the world is not bound to the logic of perception. Freedom within the imagination can be at once illusory and purposive. Because imaginative activity seems a mere projection, we're always tempted to locate causes for it. Yet it also seems capable of treating itself as shaping what emerges. And the third and fourth of my properties or categories have their origin in this, I think, always ambivalent or even unplaceable causal discourse around imagination, because it's always invited and often inadequate or exploded at the same time. So the third feature, this is not Casey, obviously. I mean, this is somebody who's a modernist. The third feature, stressed by a phenomenology imagination, is its capacity for staging infinitely subtle tonalities for situations, as perhaps every lover knows. Because there are no clear constraints on the subject or the ways, I can't resist this. You know, I'm teaching The Winter's Tale, and I'm teaching Florizel's talk to Perdita, and the students are just not interested at all. And I'm saying, I just try to sell a better sex life. I mean, I'm not even trying to sell Shakespeare. You know, just you can make up these things, and they may be true. You know. All right. Where are we? Okay. Because there are no clear constraints on the subject or the ways details are related to another, there are no categorical principles by which we can expect to draw out the relations among those details, so as to conform to any prevailing notion of sense. The principles of relation are shaped simply by the details, and our modes of apprehending them as aspects of a concretely emerging set of conjunctions. A face does not have to resemble what we think faces show. So one possibility for an imaginative representation is to reveal subtle desires and demands and fears that take strange shapes as they escape our typical routes of expression. Imaginative figuration has virtually unlimited control of the play of surfaces, fold upon fold, as details breed details, gestures breed corresponding gestures, and affective tones multiply freely. And obviously I'm thinking about Picasso, especially the portraits of women, especially the later portraits of women. But an observer also has to recognize that this kind of imaginative activity plays a significant price for its freedom. Because of their freedom from the logic of perception, the fantasy features have no specifiable depth. Viewers or readers might find the figures of imagination suggestive, but they may also find them simply unintelligible. So the return of the issue of interpretability leads us to the fourth feature. The play of surfaces often creates the very desire for in-depth interpretation that it frustrates. Few events in the domain of the arts are as distressing, for me at least, as the effort to pin down imaginative flights of fancy in terms of psychoanalytic or moral explanations, as in Freud's reading of La Tempesta, or as in your colleagues' readings of James Joyce. I won't name the colleague. purpose of this, if it is manifest at all, need be manifest only within the arrangement of surface details, and so cannot provide a discursive rationale for them, however plausible the effects achieved. I agree with Casey's claim that because of the plural surfaces imagination can develop, the only effective way to offer interpretations of imaginative activity is to grant the product the force of self-evidence. The work is replete, and so can only stand beside efforts at interpretation in partial mockery and in partial yearning for what might anchor it within the interpretive models provided by a culture. I mean by the force of self-evidence simply a distinctive process by which we establish the significance of the imaginative activity. Typically, we determine meanings by the conjunction of appropriate contexts that bear on what the speaker might want to say and how that statement might be appropriate for the occasion. With imagined worlds, there is a paucity of effective external context, so we have to rely on what we see as relations among the textual units given by the action, or the visual units. And we still build contexts that make features significant, but we have little justification for invoking those contexts beyond the way that the contexts proposed seem to emerge out of our concrete need to connect specific elements and ways of speaking within the act in question. So part of my argument, I'm going to get concrete now with Ashbery, but part of the argument I just see now also is that the sense of delight in Ashbery's poem replaces a kind of perceptual anchor with an affective anchor, so that the activity itself is interpreting itself, but not by tying itself to the physical world, but by tying it to its own processes and how those processes emerge. But I'll try to cash this out. So I want to read the instruction manual as both an implicit critique of Romantic views of imagination and a modeling of quite different means of accessing its substantial powers that come closer to honoring these phenomenological qualities that I've been talking about. I'm especially interested in how Ashbery's tone suggests the capacity to release imagination from the self-congratulatory posturing of Romantic lyricism so that it might participate more fully in a new kind of social space, not shaped in accord with the authority of the poet. In essence, imagination in this poem develops possibilities for bringing a sense of emotional resonance to bear on the world, not by interpreting that world, but by fleshing out details so that they reach out both to the possible sources of feeling in the public scene and to how an audience might be expected to internalize those feelings as elements that reveal its own capacity for shared sympathy and understanding. That is, in a way, that because Ashbery so much stresses making up this world, the pleasure in making up the world has as its kind of social correlate not so much recognizing the world as the audience is recognizing the pleasures possible in the world by virtue of making it up with it. Okay, and I didn't see that in the paper, but that's really the kind of logic of the emergence. Okay, I'm not going to remember this. By the way, just to justify the narcissism of taking notes on myself, right, which is, Stanley Fish actually tapes himself, which is a level of narcissism I can't imagine because you have to let it listen to yourself. But my argument is that in the sciences, they have research instruments. We have adrenaline. And it's really crazy not to utilize your adrenaline at its height. So that's why I think that's why I'm doing it. Okay. All right. As model, the poem becomes an instruction manual for what can be accomplished in escaping the task of writing instruction manuals. The poem's daydream becomes a mode of self-evidence, both producing and referring to how imagination can do work in the actual world. In fact, Ashbery, in choosing the daydream, establishes a mode of lyricism where production and reference are completely interwoven. The poem begins with the speaker's wishing he did not have to write an instruction manual and envying those he sees from his window, not oppressed by that task. He engages those alternatives by reverting to his typical practice of daydreaming, in this case of Guadalajara, the city in Mexico he most wants to see for the first time. So he composes the city in his daydream. First, the details seem conventional and general. How not begin with a band playing European music in the public square and the flower girls handing out flowers? It's almost as if the imagination followed a script already written and rewritten. But soon we realize that this speaker has a penchant for particular persons and colors, from one particular girl in rose and blue to serving girls in green, offering green and yellow fruit, and eventually to a parade where attention is focused on the dapper little man in deep blue. So I'm going to read. On his head sits a white hat. He wears a mustache which has been trimmed for the occasion. His dear one, his wife, is young and pretty. Her shawl is rose, pink, and white. And one of the things about, once you recognize the freedom of the imagination for details, the pleasure becomes infinite with any detail at all, almost, right? I mean, and so that's almost the texture for the jokes in the poem. If you're going to choose, then any choice you might as well enjoy, and that becomes the logic. The poem is rewritten in the logic of pleasure, really, I think, but in the logic of pleasure, like Fragonard's pleasure, rather than another more less self-conscious form of it, I suppose. The poetry here. The poetry here resides in the attention to made-up detail as a condition of a strange tone that at once acknowledges distance and self-indulgently tries to bridge that divide. Details bubble over in long lines because everything flows so easily from the conjunction of dream, conventional detail, and enthusiastic participation. Within the framework provided by these cliched details, scenes take shape that seem impossible not to visualize. So perhaps what I'm treating as stock elements are better seen as the effects of cultural grammar, into which the dream enters. The grammar offers at once a panoply of details and a sense of a shared world, because the speaker's dream offers access to what proves a common space for fantasy. And the commonness, miraculously, has no deleterious effect on the sheer exuberance of what is permitted within the dream. Now the way is prepared for treating the imagination as a complex actualizing of thoughts that Wittgenstein's understanding of philosophical grammar, I think, helps understand or helps appreciate. The poem moves beyond seeing to envisioning full participation in this constructed world as its texture of embedded details, embedded desires also become visible. I'm going to quote another passage. Here come the boys. They're skipping and throwing little things on the sidewalk, which is made of gray tile. One of them, a little older, has a toothpick in his teeth. He is silenter than the rest and affects not to notice the pretty young girls in white. But his friends notice them and shout their jeers at the laughing girls. Then, for the first time after setting up the dream, the narrator intrudes as I because he wants to hear a conversation between a particular girl and a boy that this story has produced. It's as if the collective picture of young boys and girls matters only for the particular sense of romance that it might elicit. Then, perhaps weary of this I, our narrator takes a voice that could be essentially a native guide, now strikingly in the first person plural. So he's moving, as the details manipulate, also the perspective manipulates. Let us take this opportunity to tiptoe into one of the side streets. Here you may see one of those white houses with green trim that are so popular here. Look, I told you. And then I skip a little. A woman in gray sits there, fanning herself with a palm leaf fan. She welcomes us to her patio, offers us a cooling drink. My son is in Mexico City, she says. He would welcome you too if he were here. But his job was with a bank there. So these conditionals are part now of the physical scene. Look, here's a photograph of him, this exchange of here and there. And a dark-skinned lad with pearly teeth grins out at us from the worn leather frame. We thank her for her hospitality, for it's getting late, and we must catch a view of the city before we leave from a good high place. It seems as if the more the narrator daydreams, the more he's unfolded within the details of the dream. So he becomes the only one capable of guiding us through this self-enclosing picture. Then, as the role of guide takes hold, so do the pronouns we and you that make this here a fully social object capable of being balanced with there. Here inspires a playful but profound range of indexical reference, from the space produced by the dream in which green is so popular, to the hypothetical that her son would welcome us if he were here, to the mother's directing attention to the photograph. We might also note that as here takes over, there's no need to rely on references to I. How could such intense participation not establish a sense that the subject shares his or her world? And how could such detail not shape into subjective space, even producing dialogue on the diegetical and the authorial levels? The affective power of the poem depends on its correlating two aspects of imaginative life: its productive dimensions by which it escapes writing the demanded instructional manual, and the self-reflexive dimension by which the poem fleshes out and takes pleasure in its own productive powers to develop a different kind of instructional manual. For Ashbery, the core of imaginative life is the sheer capacity to select details in a way that elicits all of its powers to inhabit and extend what the details bring to consciousness. The text becomes the presentation of a series of actions inviting an audience to participate in the transformation of scattered, insistently arbitrary details into a dense, coherent, and playful particularizing of elements that function as examples of life in Guadalajara. And the scene as it emerges, I'm going to skip that part. Each choice in the poem is experienced as playfully uncaused. But over time, the scene takes on a level of coherence that deepens our engagement, even while we know that the only evidence for this coherence is within the imaginative process itself. There's no external arbiter for what significance can unfold. Yet Ashbery is careful to produce an increasingly dense social world, because the imagined characters find their affective lives embedded in the public details, dwelt on and dwelt among by the imagination. Okay. There's not much left to the poem, but what remains considerably deepens the poem's affective intensity, in part because the poem seems intent on drawing out how the imagination comes to realize its own limitations. Then it can embrace those limitations to assert another aspect of its potential power, I think, which I'd want to make a kind of fifth condition of imagination, though it's not in Casey. Once the attention of we orients itself to the overall view of the city, there need be only a series of isolated observations based on the expression there is. But then we almost have to ask how there can be an interesting end for the daydream that has no inherent logic. Ashbery's response to the question is to shift tones. The last specific detail the poem offers is the young boy and girl, now in the heat of the day, lurking in the shadows of the bandstand. This move to the shadows then allows the poem to turn to the past tense in order to offer explicit self-reflection on what the imagination has enabled, and more strikingly, failed to enable. We've seen young love, married love, and a mother's love for her son. We've heard the music, tasted the drinks, and looked at colored houses. What more is there to do except stay? And that we cannot do. And as a last breeze freshens the top of the weathered old tower, I turn my gaze back to the instruction manual, which has made me dream of Guadalajara. In this adventure, imagination cannot conquer the pressures of time and loss, and can't successfully evade the loneliness of the capitalist system that he's got to work in, and that shaped the neediness of the poem from the start. There is ultimately a pathos to the dream condition, because however enticing the engagement in the lives of the other people, it's tragically provisional. Tragically is probably, it's sadly provisional, which much freer term, actually. We cannot stay in our fictions, which is probably why we have license to enjoy them so thoroughly. But the more the poem admits the limitations of its own imaginings, the fuller becomes its presentation of how the imagination can switch registers so that it comes to speak for the dreamers rather than for the object of the dream. One freedom the imagination has is the freedom to reflect on its escapist tendencies and to make those tendencies the focus for bonding its productions to the self-reflexive languages we typically use in characterizing tragic or sad aspects of experience. Pure imagination has no pathos because there's no other, no pressure of the real to impose limitation and pain. Ashbery's writing, on the other hand, is drenched in pathos because he's so acutely aware that time and loss are the inescapable accompaniments of presence and pleasure. But Ashbery can still honor the freedom of imagination by treating it as the necessary condition of a perpetual conflict between the urge to flee into the daydream and the recognition that daydreams, too, have their existential implications. The acknowledgement of necessity in the instruction manual is charmingly and imaginatively handled by treating necessity as the literal emergence of what Stevens would call the pressure of reality. In moving towards conclusion, Ashbery deploys an extended simile of the breeze, which is the staple of Romantic lyricism, to suspend time for a moment and further delay the task at hand. It's as if the poem really can't end. It has to produce another metaphor. Then as the speaker returns to his instructional manual, we recognize in retrospect that accepting our isolation may be the necessary precondition for appreciating what we need from other people. These real world needs provide the drive to freedom in the first place. And then freedom finds itself fascinated by what might bind it to the lives of other people in the dream and the need to accept what dreaming cannot accomplish. Here, the freedom is not the same as in most Romantic poetry because it's not the result of liberating the imagination from bondage by an epistemic process. Instead, freedom plays the role of the source of imaginative activity in the first place. And the fifth category is this kind of binding to the demands of the real, of the she real. How will it handle this kind of binding? And that's where I think the key question of imaginatively comes in. I mean, imaginatively will deal with these other factors as well, but in terms of offering, foregrounding the power of imagination, the test is ultimately how it will deal with the binding of the real world. I mean, that's one pressure on it that comes up in literary imagining that wouldn't come up in Casey's version. Okay, so I'm not going to. I will read Leda and the Swan because it's a great poem, but I'm really only kind of concentrate on two features of the poem, so I can end within 6 or 7 minutes. That look in the structure of the poem. I mean, look for the relations among the details. I mean, that's the crucial selection. In sonnets in general, I mean, that's what they honor is this selection of detail in a kind of powerful way. But this poem has kind of two kind of moments of assertion or action that are contrasted, and then two questions that are contrasted. And then I'll just elaborate the significance of how Yeats handles the questions as primarily developing this sense that the imagination's relations make possible a kind of responsiveness to the real that you have to honor its own productive capacities. That's what Yeats is, I think, dealing with by straightforwardly taking on the indicative mood, I think. I mean, that's the sort of overall structure that I want to develop. Okay, so a sudden blow, the great wings beating still above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill. He holds her helpless breast upon his breast. How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body, laid in that white rush, but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. Being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop. Okay, so the first stanza is partially interesting because of the grammatical features of it. The sudden blow and then the apposition of the wings. It starts out as it may be syntactically modify a verb, but it ends up as an absolute grammatical condition. It has no modification, and part of the point of the rape is you don't expect a lot of grammatical identification from rape, right? I mean, okay. And then there's a kind of affective question. How can those terrified vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And Yeats stresses the affectiveness of it to indicate the possibility of other kinds of questions that are going to be raised in the last poem. Then the parallel to the rape is the indicative series again of what the historical consequences. A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall. I mean, as most of you know, in Yeats, that rape introduces the Greek culture of violence and begins a kind of world historical cycle. But the interesting part for me is that in the last lines, the modifier, the being so caught up, so mastered by the brute, it begins like the great wings beating still, but here it does connect to a subject, that is the subject of the question. Did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? Now, I mean, the paper goes on and on, but the crucial point is that how can you answer the question before did she put on his knowledge power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? I mean, the could let her drop suggests that part of his power is recognizing his own lack of power, right? There's another order of being greater than the God who drove him to this tumult in the clouds. So the terms of the question are clear, but how can it be answered? And my basic point is that you can't answer it, and the poem doesn't try to answer it in the terms of history that set it up. What he does is use the grammar of the question to push it towards exclamation rather than to bind it to the possibility of answering, right? So the parallel would be, what a move if you're watching a dance performance, or, what a shot. I mean, there's a whole set of parallels between the exclamatory and the interrogative that bypass the indicative entirely. And I think that's the notion of, it's not whether or not she could put on the power before the indifferent beak, but how do you participate in the condition of that identification? So the questioning is a move towards entry into the situation rather than towards some kind of possibility of answer outside the situation. Okay, does that make sense? And so again, what Yeats is doing, and how the power of selection is coming, is that this last question pushes you back into the poem rather than into a kind of world which might answer it again, because the poem's intensities are the place where a substitute for an answer exists, and if you take away that sense of what it means to be displaced from your own being, right? And to how to know it or not. There's no outside that gets at that. So it's the sense of the imagination insisting on its own relational force. I think that's what and I mean, Ashbery is doing that in the quietest mode possible. Yeats is doing that in the loudest mode possible. But I think they're both sort of exploring these kind of capacities of imagination to put us in a different world than the world that allows indicatives. It's not a truer world, but it's a world where we can begin to address some kinds of questions that this truer world doesn't allow us to address. And I think that's what both of these poets understand. Okay, so I'll stop. And thank you for your attention and your putting up with my needs.